Shema
Yisrael,
Israel
Adonai,
Adonai
Eloheinu,
Eloheinu
Adonai,
Adonai
Echad.
Echad.
Thank you, Rachel, for saving me from my senile moment. I'm like completely blanked out. Like, what's the next word? Never mind, I've said this every day for 50 some years, but whatever. So thank you, Rachel, for saving me. So it's always good if you're having a senile moment to have a friend around to help you handle yourself. So we were discussing, and it's sort of interesting, the timing of this. Hi, Chana. Nice to be able to join. Because we're right now in the 3 weeks, meaning Wednesday actually begins a period we call the 9 days. So a week and a half plus ago, on a Thursday, was the first fast of the 17th of Tammuz that begins this 3-week period. And next Thursday, a week from this Thursday, is the saddest day in the Jewish calendar, the 9th of Av. And as we were just learning in Jewish history, we understand the meaning of these dates, because on the 10th of Tavis, which is sort of in the deadish of the winter, like January time usually, is when Nebuchadnezzar surrounded the walls of Jerusalem. And for 2.5 years, they were in siege, which is a very long time to withstand an enemy and to have enough water and food to survive somehow, until finally they broke through. 2.5 years later, in the summer, most people think it was a half a year, 10th of Tavis to the 17th of Tammuz. But we know, because we learned in Jewish history, that it was 2.5 years later, and the 17th of Tammuz is when the walls were broken in. So right now where we're in is, if you can envision this hand-to-hand combat as the Babylonian soldiers are trying to get to the temple. Now, of course, we know way past this because we've learned history past the destruction of the first temple. And we know that actually the Babylonians were very kind to us, and it was a relatively easy exile for 70 years, and the Jews prospered. We know only 42,000 went back with the first wave, and only like 1,500 the second wave. But that's later. At this moment, when they're conquering us, they were quite vicious. And even in the march, as they took us all captive from Jerusalem to Babylonia, they were quite vicious, and many people died on that march. But once we actually got there, then they decided, oh, we're Semites like them. We ultimately stem from this land. Abraham, our forefather, came from this Babylonian land, so they like us. But they were quite vicious, so we have really almost like inch by inch, street by street, block by block conquest to get to the temple. The Babylonians understood the same way we understood that was the point. And that happened on the 9th of Av. So right now it's sort of a very mild period of mourning now, but starting on Wednesday, which is Rosh Chodesh. Of course, we know that Rosh Chodesh is the first day of a new month, and that's generally a very, very happy day. It's the most Mashiach day of the month. It's the day when we have our highest soul powers inside of ourselves. So we'll all have very special powers on Wednesday. But it's also the beginning of the 9 days. And those 9 days are like 9 days of semi-mourning for the temple. There's a lot of restrictions. And we don't eat meat besides on the Shabbos. We don't eat new fruits or buy items that would be considered significant. We don't listen to music. We haven't been listening to music or dancing this whole time, this whole 3-week period. It's also a good time to add in more, because just as when the temple was destroyed, every one of us is viewed as sort of a temple. And we base this on a verse. It's a biblical verse. When God commanded us to build the temple, which in the desert was a tabernacle, a traveling temple, the verse says, "And build for me a tabernacle, and I will dwell in them." And the sages say, what do you mean? Build for me a tabernacle and I will dwell in them. Build for me a tabernacle and I will dwell in it. Who's the them? And the answer, the them is every single Jew. Because every single Jew is God's temple. Every single Jew is God's home. And just as some 1900 years ago, the temple was destroyed, what I'm just recounting to you is really the history of the first temple, because of course that's what we learned in history. On the exact same day, 490 years later, the second temple was destroyed, meaning the other fast days, the 10th of Tavis, the 17th of Tammuz, the 3rd of Tishrei, Those are unique to the era of the first temple. Those dates didn't reoccur in the destruction of the second temple. But the most pivotal date, the date of the destruction of the temple, was the date of the destruction of both temples, and many other very, very sad things happened to the Jewish people on that date. It's a date designated for sadness. Sort of interesting because there's the ultimate fast day in the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur. There's the 9th of Av, and then there's sort of like all other fasts. And Yom Kippur and the 9th of Av have a lot of commonalities. In both of them, they're the only fast days where the fast begins at night. All other fast days begin early morning, sunrise. The 17th of Tammuz began about 3:35 in the morning, but it didn't begin the night before. The 9th of Av and Yom Kippur will begin about 7-ish something, 7, 8 something at night. Obviously, all fast days you can't eat or drink, but on Yom Kippur and the 9th of Av, you also can't wash yourself, you can't anoint yourself, you can't wear leather, you can't have marital relations. So in the sense, they're both pretty similar, and they're both the most significant fast days and the hardest ones to not fast from a religious perspective. But they're actually very different ends of the spectrum. Because Yom Kippur is such a holy day. We're all like the angels. We're supposed to be in synagogue. Many people are accustomed to dress all in white like an angel and pray to God all day long and be so beyond food, so beyond the physical. And the 9th of Av is like the saddest day of the whole year. So we're so below food. We're so beneath it. And this very intense, heavy, I fast very easily, but I can't handle the 9th of Av because it's such a heavy energy of mourning. And that lasts till about midday of the 9th of Av, which will mean Thursday, next week Thursday, we're not talking about this Thursday, about 1 o'clock. And then the energy lifts already. It's just, you could feel it in the air. It's not as intense. You still can't do everything, but it's not as intense. So it's easier to function for me. So why are we saying this? Because right now we're learning about this period, and this is sort of parallel to what we're going through. So again, these 9 days begin on Wednesday, which is Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh is a very happy day. Rosh Chodesh is a very Mashiach day, the most Mashiach day of the month. And this is a very Mashiach month because all of these fast days that commemorate destruction, the 10th of Tavis, the 17th of Tammuz, the 9th of Av, and the 3rd of Tishrei, by Mashiach, the prophet says will all be holidays. It's not just like, okay, thank God we're not fasting, thank God we're not in pain, thank God we don't have an exile, but actually they'll all be holidays of liberation, because we'll understand then that everything we went through was actually God bringing us to redemption. Meaning we look at it and we say, no, these are destructions. But God keeps the laws. And according to law, you're not allowed to destroy the temple. You're not even allowed to take off one stone from the temple. You're not even allowed to crack the stone in the altar. So if God keeps all of his laws, I mean, they're his laws, he keeps them. Every rule he says to us, he keeps himself. So if God's keeping the rules, and if according to the rules, you can't in any way, shape, or form slightly mar the temple, how did God destroy an entire temple? And the answer is because the only time you're allowed to break it down is to build something even better. So that was God's reasoning, that each time as he's breaking down the first and breaking down the second is to create a far more magnificent third. And that's why the 9th of Av, which is the day of the destruction for both temples, is going to be the biggest holiday, like the red letter day. Like we think now, maybe our children think of Purim or Simchat Torah. That's going to be the 9th of Av. It's going to be such a day where the Mashiach energy is shining. So this is a pretty special Mashiach month. It actually says that Mashiach is born on the 9th of Av, which of course doesn't really, what does that mean? He was born on the 9th of Av. At the moment of destruction, he was born. What would a baby help? But it means his energy was shining. So the 9th of Av is very Mashiach. The 15th of Av, when the moon, the energy of Av in its fullness is very Mashiach. And Rosh Chodesh, this Wednesday, because Rosh Chodesh contains all the energy of the whole month, is also very, 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 very Mashiach. But again, it also begins this 9-day period. We have lots of limitations. No meat, no wine, except Shabbos, and Shabbos the meat, Shabbos the wine. No blessing of the Shechianu on a new food or new garment. No music, no dancing, no purchases. A lot of limitations, no swimming, no boating, bathing. All of these things are very restricted. At the same time, because as we said, we're really the temple, we're in miniature, each one of us a temple, we want to rebuild and help our temple. Not that we were ever destroyed. No matter where we think we are in our relationship to God, perhaps no matter how far we think we are in our relationship to God, no Jew's temple is destroyed. None of us were razed to the ground, because the foundation of every Jew's relationship to God is always intact. No matter how little a person knows, no matter how little a person thinks they do, every Jew's foundation to God is intact, which means every Jew believes in God, has an innate love of God, has an innate fear of God, has an innate connection to God. So our foundation, every one of us, the foundation of every one of our temples is intact. But the walls are not in such great shape. Maybe we need to repair the ceiling and the walls and the floors. So it's good in these days. Also, it's good in these days because we need both to repair our temples and bring extra light in, and because we need extra protection, because these are like hard days for the Jewish people. So it's good to add in Torah, in prayer, and in charity in these days. In Torah, it could be any addition for, it might be nice to learn some of the laws about the 9th of Av. Go online, there's a wealth of Torah online. Any addition every day for extra blessings, extra rebuilding your temple, and extra protection. In prayer, one could add one extra psalm, an extra chapter of Tehillim for each of these days of the 9 days. Actually, sorry, going back to Torah study, probably the best Torah study is to learn online the laws of the temple. Maimonides' laws of the temple, called in Hebrew Hilchot Beit HaBechira, or Hilchos Beit HaBechira, which is Maimonides' laws of the temple. That's really the best thing to learn now. As we mentioned this, I believe, in both in Jewish history and perhaps mentioning this time, that the prophet Yechezkel, very unusually, had a prophecy in Babylonia. I say this very usually because traditionally prophecy was only in Israel. He was in Babylonia and had a prophecy of the ultimate temple. That time it wasn't called the third, it was called the temple, which really was the third. I remember mentioning this. I remember we discussed this. And God said, go tell the Jews. And he said, why would I give them pain? We'll wait till they go back to Israel. And God said, just because my children are in exile, my temple should also be desolate. Tell them about the temple. Teach them about the temple. Because if they're learning about the temple, it's being rebuilt. So that famous dialogue between the prophet Ezekiel, Yechezkel, and God is a foundation for the concept that in these 3 weeks, which is commemorating the destruction and focused on the rebuilding, we like to learn every day about the temple. So a really user-friendly, great way to learn about the temple is learning Maimonides' laws of the temple, which again, I'm sure you can find online very easily. Learning a law a day could take about a minute, would be a wonderful addition to Torah study. In prayer, it could be adding one extra prayer, be adding an extra chapter of Psalms, Tehillim. And in charity, it'd be good like every morning and every afternoon just to give an extra nickel in your charity box. But the extra Torah study, the extra prayer, and the extra charity, both to rebuild your temple and as protection during this more difficult time for the Jewish people, which is going to culminate next Thursday, a week from this Thursday, in the fast of the 9th of Av, which should definitely be transformed way before next Thursday to the enormous celebration of the 9th of Av. What we're looking for, the celebration of Mashiach, when the 9th of Av is going to be the biggest red letter day on our calendar. So that was just, in a sense, the history we've been discussing, and of course, living with the times where we're holding right now, just important to focus on that. So where we were discussing last week, we were looking at the Jews that had come back. And we said that, in a sense, it was sort of sad because not that many Jews came back because it was hard. It's almost, we said, a parallel to modern times where it's hard for people to go back to Israel. Maybe not nowadays. Nowadays, people just think it might be a safer place. But, you know, when the state was first established, or before the state was established in Israel, it's you go into a desert. What's your financial security? What's your, security with the Arabs? There's reasons people would feel they'd rather live as Jews elsewhere. So that is, in essence, what was happening in Babylonia, where the Jews were financially secure, where there was political security. They were respected. They had their own political infrastructure within the Babylonian society. They were safe. They were secure. They were comfortable. They'd already been there 70 years. So they just weren't ready to pick up and leave. So it was a very, very idealistic 42,000 that went back to Jerusalem. And as we said, that they went back and they thought they would build the temple, but the Sumerians badmouthed us to Ahasuerus, as you remember. And Ahasuerus, who was definitely looking for an excuse to stop the building, said, no, stop, done. And then we said his his son through Esther, Darius II, 2 years into his reign gave permission, and it took 4 years, and we built it, which was an amazing, amazing, special, special feeling. But it wasn't like we entered the age of the Messiah then. It was still very hard in Israel. It was still very poor. There was still much enmity from all the nations around that were not happy that we came back, that had been much happier when we were gone. It was financially difficult. As we're saying, it was in terms of safety and security from the nations difficult. And it started being spiritually difficult, even though the people that went back were the idealists, but they didn't have the spiritual infrastructure either. So we discussed then the various great Jewish leaders that had gone back with them and that were trying to keep them like on task. We said when they first went back, they were led by Zerubbabel, who was from the kingly family of David. He was a direct descendant, like a grandson of the second to last king the Jews had. So he was of the Davidic line of kings. But more important than him were the spiritual leaders. And we see here a shift. I think I remember Chav asking this question last class. We see here a shift that from this point, the real leaders of the Jewish people that are guiding them are their spiritual leaders. Meaning we have Zerubbabel. Now Zerubbabel, of course, couldn't come back as king because this land is not independent. It's still under Babylonia. The fact that Koresh, gave the Jews permission to go return to Israel didn't mean he gave them independence. They were going back from where they were not allowed to leave, to another Babylonian province that happened to be their ancient homeland. So when they were back in Israel, they were back in a Babylonian colony, so to speak, if we could envision it that way, at least in the eyes of the Babylonians. So Zerubbabel did not become king. That would have been a rebellion, and then he would probably been squashed in like days. They weren't trying to become kings. They were just trying to live in Israel. So Zerubbabel didn't really have the power, and he wasn't really leading the people. The leaders of the people were the sages. As we said, this great, great, great leader of Ezra, we said he was so great that our sages say if God hadn't given the Torah through Moshe, he would have given it through Ezra. That's how great Ezra was. And Ezra worked very, very, very hard to keep up the physical and moral needs of the Jews. But he wasn't able to do it enough. They were still in a really bad state. And then we said Nehemiah joined him. Nehemiah had not gone initially, not because he was lacking in his zealous desire to be in Israel, but rather because he had stayed back to attend to his holy and aged teacher of Torah, who was in Babylonia, and he just didn't feel he could leave him. He felt he had to be there for him. And when he passed away, then Nehemiah joined Ezra in Israel, and the two of them became like this dynamic duo. We usually think of them in one term, Ezra and Nehemiah. They both have books in Tanakh, in the Old Testament, obviously we don't really use that term in the Bible, and we often, even though they're two separate books, we usually view it as one book, Ezra and Nehemiah. They were that closely linked. So both of them, again, there was no competition. They were working hand in hand to really keep the Jews on solid Torah footing. And what they understood was that Judaism was now at a crossroads. And the reason why Judaism was at a crossroads was because there was an incredible shift that it was taking place now. For the first time ever, it was gradual. But now it was full flesh, which was that the majority of the Jews lived outside of Israel. Now, of course, for 70 years, the Jewish people lived outside of Israel. But that was different because that was viewed as sort of a temporary situation. Just as all the Gentile nations were aware that this exile was for 70 years. And we spoke, if you remember, how Belshazzar miscalculated and made a party because he was counting from the first wave of the 3 waves of exile. How Achashverosh miscalculated and made like a year-long party because he miscalculated. And how ultimately the 7 years was from the destruction of the first to the rebuilding of the second. So the Jews knew they were there for 70 years. So that wasn't viewed as like permanent. It's 70 years and then we're going back home. But as we see, the 70 years elapsed and the Jews didn't go back home. Not because they couldn't. They could have gone back home then, but because they chose not to. So since they chose not to go back home, now we have, for the first time ever, a seemingly more permanent situation of the majority of the Jews not in Israel. which is really the beginning of the concept of the diaspora, which of course expanded. At this point, it's Israel and Babylonia. So it's still pretty centered in these two areas. And this Babylonian center lasted for generations. Way after the destruction of the Second Temple, Babylonia is still the stronghold of Torah and of the Jewish people. Even when the Jews started dispersing and entering into Europe, which happened after the second destruction of the Second Temple, some 420 years from now, when they're taken by the Roman soldiers and in this fashion are dispersed over North Africa and Europe, still Babylonia was a Torah center for many, many years from now. But it's the beginning of what our sages perceive. The sages understand that Judaism is shifting. Judaism is really shifting. And they realize we need to do things to make sure Judaism survives this. Even though you could say, they could think, oh, now we have a temple. You know, what are they worried about? They have a temple. But the sages understood we're still in a different situation. Because even though we have a temple, we do not have the situation where the majority of the Jews are in Israel. There's actually many laws, like, for example, the sabbatical year, the Shemitah year, from a Torah, from a biblical perspective, is only operative when the majority of the Jews are in Israel. Well, guess what? Now the majority of the Jews aren't in Israel, because we got like some 43,000 in Israel. But everyone else is in Babylonia. That's where the majority of the Jews are. So the sages realized we need to do certain things to put Judaism in a situation where it's going to withstand the diaspora. Obviously, they were successful because look at us today. We've withstood a diaspora they would never have envisioned. We've withstood horrors they would never have envisioned. We've withstood such a scattering of our people they would never have envisioned. We've withstood such a integration into secular life they would never have envisioned. So obviously they did a good job, and obviously God helps. But to bring Judaism to the next level, that it's going to survive diaspora, they convened probably the greatest gathering of sages that ever was. And those sages are called, in English, the men of the Great Assembly. If you ever hear it in Hebrew, it's called Anshe Knesset Hagadola, or Anshe Knesset Hagadola. And in English, we say the men of the Great Assembly. Now, what was this Great Assembly? Well, we don't really know. What we know is it's a gathering of 120 of the greatest sages of the Jewish people at that time. What we don't know is, did they do something unusual and actually make a legal body of 120? What I mean by that is Judaism is very clear in its rules and procedures, and there is no such thing as a gathering of 120 people, meaning you can have the smallest tribunal court, which is 3. Nowadays, that's the only tribunal court we're allowed to have, is 3. But in the times when the Jews were in Israel, in the times of the temples, 3 was the smallest of the courts. And then there were larger courts, and the largest court, like the Supreme Court of the Jewish people, was called the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin had 70 members, or you could view it as 71, because it shouldn't be an even number. So let's call it 71 members, the leader and 70 people. The 71 greatest sages of the Jews at that time. And that's as far as it goes. That's called the Sanhedrin. They met actually in a certain area of the temple courtyard itself. So within the temple, we have the Supreme Court functioning, which is teaching Torah to the Jewish people and educating all matters that reach that high in the Jewish court system. That's a Sanhedrin, and that's 71 elders. But the men of the Great Assembly were 120. So we don't know, and it's sort of a question historically, what at that time did they just gather 120 people and say, guess what, we're not going to stop at 70. We need everyone we can, because we really have to really discuss very significant matters. Maybe. And maybe all 120 of these operate at the same time. That's what some think. Others think no, they wouldn't have changed the system. Just a second. Sorry. So some say that it was 120, and they just said it was like what's called Hora'as Sha'ah. Hora'as Sha'ah means it's for this time. Just 1 second. Sorry. So some say it was 120 men, and some say no, it was the traditional number 70. But because this was such a significant situation, they had 50 alternates. So they had the 71 elders, but they also had another 50 like extras to like fill in, to sometimes exchange positions. So they were really gleaning from the knowledge and wisdom of all 120 within the structure of a 71 man council. So what was this group, either of 120 or 70 plus 50 alternates, doing? What were they judging? What they were judging is, what are we going to do to preserve Judaism? What are we going to do to ensure that Judaism will survive, not just what they were currently going through. What they were currently going through wasn't so bad. There was Jews in Israel, they had a temple, and there's Jews in Babylonia. But they understood where it was going to go. They were right. So what are we going to put into place to keep and ensure the survival of Judaism through what we see coming up ahead? And what they did was many things. The head of this august body was Ezra. When we said Ezra partnered with Nehemiah, they were leading the Jewish people. As I said to you at this point, the leaders of the Jewish people are not political leaders, they are spiritual leaders. And Ezra was the spiritual leader of the Jews in Israel, and he was the leader of these men of the Great Assembly. But he had many great lights with him. Some were prophets, some were not. We're sort of coming toward the tail end of when prophecy is very overt among the Jewish people. Truly, prophecy never left us. But we're coming to the time, in about 50 years from now, is when prophecy is sort of going to seemingly stop. Never really stopped. It's always been there. We've always had prophecy. But it's been much more concealed. So we're coming to the end of the prophecy, but there's still prophets around at this point. So we have prophets among these 120, and we have non-prophets. We have just great sages. Mordechai was part of this body of 120. Daniel, for those of you who remember Daniel, we mentioned him, was part of this body of 120. Obviously, Ezra and Nehemiah, the three of the last of the prophets, meaning the last of those prophets. When we count the prophets, we come up with like about 50. There was really about 1,200,000 prophets. Prophecy at that time, from when the Jews left Egypt, I mean, even before in Egypt, there were prophets. Aaron was a prophet in Egypt. Miriam was a prophetess in Egypt. Moshe was obviously a prophet. So it wasn't that prophecy started once the Jews left Egypt, but I'm sort of calling it when they left Egypt as when we became a people. Until about this time, the greatest spiritual achievement of a Jew was to become a prophet. And as we mentioned, I remember we mentioned this earlier, the Jews really worked to be prophets. It wasn't like it just came on you. It was really a spiritual work, and they had schools, not schools as we think of today with classrooms and desks and tuition, but schools as groups of people that would band together to together try to attain the spiritual stature of a prophet. They were called B'nai. B'nai means child of. B'nai Hanaviyim, but it doesn't mean, and it means we're children of prophets, but it means they were like, wannabe prophets in training. So they would usually cohort together with a prophet for him to sort of give them the guidance, how to become spiritually higher and higher, more and more detached from the physical, closer and closer to God, to attain prophecy. That was like the wow. Different ones of us might have different visions of what would be that wow achievement. In those days, it was to be a prophet of God. So our sages say the Jews had as many prophets as double the number that left Egypt. Now, really, 3 million people left Egypt. But if thinking of but perhaps they were thinking of the number we usually use, which is the number of men between the ages of 20 and 60 that left Egypt, which is 600,000. So double 600,000 is 1,200,000. So there were at least 1,200,000 prophets. But we don't know their names. We don't know their names because maybe they got prophecy once in their life. It still makes you a prophet forever. Maybe they received prophecy many times. It was just personal. It was just for them. It was never, God was talking to them about them. So it was never something they shared with us. Or maybe they were even prophets of renown, and people came to them and they advised people and they had prophecies for the Jewish people. But their prophecies were not eternal. By eternal meaning that this prophecy is to last the Jews throughout the duration of exile. A prophecy, what's called by our sages, a prophecy for generations. The prophecies that are recorded, as we have Samuel and Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, these are the prophets. Not only were they from the greatest prophets we had, but for that reason, they were the ones that were given prophecies for all generations. Which means when I would learn today any of these prophecies, they're relevant for me. Well, they were talking then to the people then about what's going on then. True. But they're also talking now to the people now about what's going on now. That's a prophet for generations. So the last of the prophets for generations that we know were three: Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. And the reason I'm bringing this in is because all three of them were also part of this august assembly of the men of the great assemblage. So we've got Mordecai that we know, we've got Daniel that we know, we've got Ezra and Nehemiah that we know. You see, we know lots of great people. We've got Malachi, Zechariah, Haggai, the last of the prophets, meaning the last of the people that have prophecy that was recorded for generations. From the youngest of these men was someone you don't know yet, but we will discuss him because he's going to be like the leader of the next generations. He was like from the youngest of this group, transitioning into becoming the leader of what's going to be. And his name was Shimon, Simon the Tzaddik. He was so saintly, very rarely do the Jews give someone the title the Tzaddik, the absolute saint. But he was called that, Shimon HaTzaddik, Simon the Tzaddik. So he was also part of this group. So they said, okay, we've got to make Judaism work. We've got to figure out a way that we can ensure and put certain things in place so we'll handle the diaspora. We'll handle what we see is happening, even though now we're in Israel, some of us, and we have a temple, but we see where it's going, and we've got to keep a way to keep us unified and keep us connected to God. So before I go into what they did anyone have any questions on anything we've said so far? Okay. So what did they do? So one thing they did that was considered very, very significant was they formalized the text of prayers and of blessings. Meaning, prayer is a biblical commandment. God gave us 613 commandments, and the rabbis added 10,000 some more. Prayer is one of the 613. It is literally written in the Torah, in the Bible, that we have an obligation to pray. But it doesn't say how often to pray. It doesn't say what to pray. So there's various understandings of what's biblical and what's rabbinic in our prayers now. Do we view it that God just wants us to talk to him every day, but the rabbis said 3 times a day and the rabbis gave the liturgy of prayer? Do we view it as God said, turn to me when you need me, and the rabbi said, turn to God every day? There's various discussions among the sages exactly what is the biblical command, exactly like where did the biblical end and the rabbinic begin. But we definitely know it's a biblical command, and we definitely know the rabbis gave structure to it. So at this point, now remember, we're holding roughly, I figured this out last week quickly, let's figure this out this week also quickly, right? We're about 1,000 years after the giving of the Torah at this time. So about 1,000 years ago, the Jews were commanded to pray. And for 1,000 years, they've been praying whatever comes to their lips, whenever it comes to their lips. That has been prayer.
Question.
Yes, Chava.
So somehow I remember that when we had temple, right, and you're discussing the time we still have a temple, that sacrifices were there, right? So people brought sacrifices, but after the temple was destroyed, then instead of sacrifices, we got I don't know, shachas and mincha. That was the prayers instead of sacrifices. Is that,
You are
if
absolutely
I remember
correct.
that correctly?
You are absolutely correct, and you're pointing out a great mistake that a very educated person could make, because everything you said is true, which would lead everyone to think as, what you said is perfect. You get 100% on your check. But you're still wrong, because nobody puts in this little piece of information that you're now learning. Meaning what Chav is saying is a saying of our sages. Prayers are instituted in lieu of the sacrifices. It's written in the Talmud, it's discussed in Jewish law, it's discussed in Jewish philosophy. What Chav says is 100% true, which would lead anyone to think that, okay, Jews never prayed, they offered sacrifices. And after the destruction of the second temple, no more sacrifices, so we pray, as the sages say. Tfilas keneged tmidim sidron. The sages organized prayers in lieu of the sacrifices. So you're right, but what I'm saying is, despite all that, you're wrong, because prayer is a biblical commandment. So from the beginning of time, from when they had a tabernacle, and for the entire duration of the first temple, and for the entire duration of the second temple, Jews always prayed. They always prayed. What happened was, with the removal of the ability to offer the sacrifices, prayers assumed the weight and the relationship to God of a sacrifice. Meaning, and honestly, very educated people don't know this, because they would know that prayers are instead of sacrifices. So I don't always start to pray. I guess after the destruction of the temples. But no, from the beginning of time, of course, if people thought of things, they remember things that actually made them realize people did pray, but they probably don't realize it. From the beginning, from the giving of the Torah, we have the tabernacle, which means we had offerings, and simultaneously we have Jews praying. But prayer was not standardized. And again, there's various understandings among the sages what it meant then. I mean, the sages in the time of the Talmud are looking back, what did it mean? And some say it meant that when a Jew was in trouble, he turned to God. And some say it meant that every day a Jew turned to God. Definitely there was no standard liturgy, that's for sure. How do we know this? We see that it says that, for example, when Samuel's mother was barren, his mother's name was Hannah. She was a very, very righteous woman, a great tzaddikus and a prophetess, obviously of great stature, to deserve to have a son like Samuel, who was, as we said, the greatest of all the judges. And she was barren for many, many years. She was suffering for many, many years with her barren state. She wasn't only barren, she was very in pain and torn. And so it took up her whole life, just this, what she was dealing with. And it says that she went into the temple and she was praying. She poured out her heart to God. So there was prayer then. They didn't know what she was doing because they didn't recognize her prayer, because prayer didn't have any standard form. Daniel, many years later, I might have mentioned, I alluded to this incident, but I didn't tell you exactly the details. If you remember when I sort of alluded to Daniel getting thrown to the lion's den, and the lions didn't touch him. So all the advisors said, oh, the lions aren't hungry. And Darius said, oh, great, let's throw you to the lions and we'll see what happens. And they all got thrown to the lions, and the lions gobbled them and their families up before they hit the ground. So what happened then was, Darius very much favored the Jews and very much favored Daniel. And his other advisors were jealous. So they tried to think of a way to force the king to get rid of Daniel. And of course, they knew that Daniel prayed every day, as Jews prayed. So they tricked the king into making a rule that for 30 days, no one could pray to anyone but him. Like, oh, you're such the great and the glorious and the best ruler. Why should anyone talk to anyone but you? Oh, yeah, I'm very flattered. This feels awesome. Yeah, let's for 30 days, no one talk to anyone but me. And then, oh my gosh, what did I just do? Of course, this was a trap for Daniel, which it was. Of course, he continued praying. And of course, he got caught. I mean, everyone knew he prayed. And then he was thrown to the lions. And then the lions, instead of eating him, bowed to him. And then he was taken out of the pit, and all the advisors were thrown in, and they got eaten up. But again, just looking at it from this angle. So Daniel was praying every day, and everyone knew he prayed every day, obviously. So prayer was there. As the sacrifices became completely removed, which is really after the destruction of the second temple, then the way we connect to God through sacrifices became through prayer. Prayer became the medium to achieve what the sacrifices achieved. So originally, when there was a tabernacle, which was over 400 years, the first temple was over 400 years, the second temple was over 400 years, they're offering sacrifices every day. Prayer was still necessary, but it wasn't a medium to attain what the sacrifices attained. Now, our prayer, besides being the biblical need and ability to connect to God in prayer, is also achieving all of the spiritual benefits of the sacrifices, which is what our sages mean by saying that the prayers are now in lieu of the sacrifices. And of course, the fact that the prayers are in lieu of the sacrifices is in a sense a tremendous, if we could use the word, advantage. Because in the times of the temple, if you want to offer a sacrifice, you had to travel to Jerusalem. It took a long time. You had to spend a lot of money. An animal was a lot of money. You know, a lot of things. How often did you do it? And now every time you open up your lips, you pray, you can achieve all of the spiritual advantages of sacrifices. But that development of prayer is only when we don't have sacrifices. That was a smart question. But so there's always prayer. But prayer was always, again, from the beginning of time, obviously way before the Jews became people, you know, it says that when Isaac and Rebekah, when Yitzhak and Rivkah were childless, as they were childless for 20 some years, says they prayed. They prayed to God. Prayer isn't a new concept, isn't a concept that just came when the Jews left Egypt. When the Jews were in Egypt and suffering, they prayed to God. So we've always turned to God in prayer. And it was always whatever comes out of your heart. But the sages realized that the Jewish people are not going to be on the level to communicate like that with God. That it's just whatever comes out of their heart, because we're going to lose our sensitivity to like find our way in the heavenly chambers to access God. And therefore, they said, we have to give the Jews the scaffolding tools. We have to give the Jews the liturgy that they will know how to ascend to God through their prayers. And it's interesting because, of course, nowadays we know there are various versions of prayer. There's the Ashkenazic prayer book. There's the Sephardic prayer book. There's the Arizal, which is the Kabbalistic prayer. There's Chabad, which is a version of the Arizal. So this is almost like parallel in the temple. Again, prayer is like to connect to God, to enter into his temple. In the temple, there were 13 gates to come into the temple. 13 because each tribe had their own gate. So there were 12, one for each tribe, because each tribe had his own personal service to God. And if you were from the people of Benjamin, you went in through Benjamin's gate. And if you were from the people of Shimon, you went in through Shimon's gate. But there was 13 gates because there was an extra gate for all the Jewish people. So prayer is trying to be that ultimate gate, especially the Arizal, Kabbalistically, and then Chabad, trying to, in essence, find the most authentic version of the Arizal, is really trying to be that 13th gate that we all, every single Jew from any, as we call it, denomination, can enter and to connect to God. But again, the general reason why the sages now are establishing these fixed times and fixed versions of the words of prayer is because they understand that as the Jews are not going to be in Israel, they're going to be on a lower level, we're going to be scattered in the diaspora, who knows if we'll be able to just talk to God and we'll be able to reach the highest realms. So they gave us words that those words reach the highest realms. So that was considered a tremendous, tremendous spiritual accomplishment of the men of the Great Assembly to create the liturgy of prayer. And they did it so any Jew, wherever he is, however simple he is, however ignorant he is, but as long as he has the words of prayer, he can talk in a way that his prayers can ascend literally on high. It's very interesting because Maimonides, who lived 800 some years ago, 800 plus years ago at this point, he writes in his book of the recording all the mitzvahs, he writes basically the prayer for us, the version of the prayer, the Haggadah, the Siddur, and it's really amazing because he wrote this over 800 years ago, and what he writes is pretty consistent to what we have today. It didn't really change. And nowadays, across the world, there are, various nuances between Ashkenazic and Sephardic and Arizal and Chabad, but more or less, across the world, we're all praying the same way. So what these sages did then has carried us through for about 2,500 years. So for about 2,500 years, the Jews have been praying as the sages enacted then. Now, something else, going back to what Chava said about the idea of prayers being in lieu of the sacrifices, also relates to the times of the prayers. That we have a morning prayer, an afternoon prayer, and an evening prayer. And the morning prayer is parallel to the first offering every day, standard every day, the first offering. And the afternoon prayer is standard to the final offering, which was in the afternoon. But then we have an evening prayer because some days there were so many offerings that between the morning offering and the afternoon offering, we didn't finish all the offerings that had to be offered that day. So then we offered others. And those others is what created the idea of the evening prayer, which again supports this idea of the prayers in lieu of the offerings. On the other hand, the idea of praying 3 times a day actually goes back to our patriarchs, because we say Abraham instituted prayer in the morning, Isaac instituted prayer in the afternoon, and Jacob instituted prayer in the evening, because we see biblically where Abraham prayed in the morning, and we see where it says that Isaac was praying in the afternoon, and it says we see where Jacob was praying in the evening. So on one hand, morning, afternoon, evening is from the patriarchs. On one hand, morning, afternoon, evening is in lieu of the sacrifices, because prayer really has this duality. It's really covering both bases. Rachel, what was your question?
I think somewhere in Psalms, there is a place where it says, I will pray or talk to you 3 times a day. 3 times a day. And in commentaries, they say it
refers to Shachris ben Chaymaira.
Yeah.
Interesting. Trying to think what that verse is.
I will try to find it.
Find it for me, right? It's not translating in my brain, and I should remember it. It's from the Psalms. But okay, so that goes back to another source of this idea. So again, there's so many like rippling parallel layers that are all true. They're all true, and there's depths and depths of layers of what's going on in these prayers. Now, something else to understand in the shift of what the sages are doing is that they're also, by creating this idea of the liturgy of prayer, they're also making prayer a communal practice. Meaning now we all say the same words, so we're all going to get together and say them together. That never happened until this point. There was the idea, so was there a shul before this time in our history? Were the Jews for the first 1,000 years of their life without a shul? There was a synagogue, but the synagogue was not for prayer because they didn't pray in the synagogues. That wasn't the concept. Prayer was something personal, you to God. Even following the thought that it's a biblical injunction to pray every day to God, there's not a specific time. Yes, it was ideal to do it, as we're saying, 3 times a day. It was ideal to do it morning, afternoon, and evening, but you didn't have to. It was very optional. So any point of the day, you turned to God and you talked. That was called prayer. Maybe you did it 10 times a day. Maybe you did it once a day. That was called prayer. So what did they have their synagogues for? Their synagogues were for the Torah reading. Now remember, we learned, because we learned this a few weeks ago, that for most of that 1,000 years, the Torah was read 1 day a week. It was read on the Sabbath, right? The Torah portion, which went through various configurations until that became standardized, was read once a week on Shabbos. Very recently, we said this was one of the injunctions of Ezra, right? Remember, this is one of the things Ezra instituted, is he said, you can't go and only hear Torah once a week. That's not good enough. You guys need more Torah than that. So he instituted, we're going to also read it on Monday and Thursday. Remember that you shouldn't go 3 days without Torah. So at that point, which is basically now, maybe it was 10 years before, 20 years before, this is this era, now the Jews have shifted that, we go to synagogue 3 times a week. We go on a Monday to hear Torah, we go on a Thursday to hear Torah, and then we go on a Shabbos to hear a lot of Torah. But that was still the whole concept of synagogue. I don't know if they I mean, obviously synagogue is not a Hebrew word, Beit Knesset. I don't know if then they called it that, because there was no concept of prayer attached. Now, because the sages are standardizing the words of our prayer, with that comes the whole concept of we're going to pray together. We're going to pray in a quorum. Certain of these words we're describing and instituting can only be said in a quorum. So now suddenly the synagogue moves from where you went once a week to where you go 3 times a week to where you go 3 times a day. Prayer moves from a personal relationship with God to a communal activity. So you see the wisdom of our sages in this. Remembering, they're understanding Jews are going to be spread really far. Jews are not going to have the secure, foundations and like pillars to lean on. The Jewish people will be weak. So we've got to put in Judaism things that will help them be strong. So look at the direction they're thinking. One, of course, is we have to make standard the text, because you won't be on the spiritual level to know what to say yourself. But 2, they are now morphing, instead of envisioning that central temple, where if the Jews are in Babylonia, when do they go there? Officially, they're supposed to go 3 times a year, but they obviously all didn't. So we're going to take your little Beit Knesset, where you go once a week, to where you go 3 times a day, in a group, together. So we're building this community. We're building this serving God together. We're building a need for the Jews to live close together. A religious Jew can't serve God fully if he's in a barren island, or if he decided he wants to live in, I don't know where. He needs other people around. If he needs people for his prayers, of course, we're going to need people to have the kosher food. We're going to need people to have the holy books. We're going to need a shochet. We're going to need one to circumcise our children. We're going to need schools. But most closely, we need a shul. We need a shul we can walk to for the Sabbath, because we pray together. So this instituting the prayers was not only helping us because spiritually we might not all know how to talk to God. It was shifting the face of Judaism to really create these small groupings, as small as a synagogue, that are going to be a very close-knit support, a very close-knit advocacy group to keep us going in this times that we've been going through for all these years. I know it's at 9, but something else the sages did at this assembly that was very, very significant is they achieved a tremendous spiritual accomplishment. What was it? What it was, and I know we've actually have mentioned this before in passing, but this is now where we're really actually studying them so we can understand who did it. They abolished the desire for idolatry. Meaning, in the times of the first temple and before, the greatest downfall of the Jewish people always came through idolatry. Even now, in the Torah portions we just read, how men from the tribe of Shimon, of Simon, sinned with idolatry, 24,000 of them. They died in this plague, 24,000 Jews, because of the sin of idolatry. This is in the desert. This is pretty holy people. So when the Jews were in Egypt, they were idol worshippers. Just as the Egyptians around them were idol worshippers, they were idol worshippers. We see in the desert, it came back to some of them. When they went to Israel, they became influenced by the nations around them. They fell into idolatry. The first temple was destroyed because of idolatry. So the sages at this point are saying, you know, God, this is too much. This is too much. Your children can't handle this. You're only supposed to give us what you can handle. They cannot handle it. So they all prayed. This was not a legal injunction as we think of like instituting the liturgy of prayer. This was a spiritual energy of all 120 praying to God one unified prayer. Remove from your children the desire for idolatry. They can't handle it. Please take it away from them. And God listened. There's a saying of our sages that when a tzaddik decrees, God fulfills. Here you had 120 of the greatest tzaddikim, the greatest saints of that time, decreeing, take away idolatry. They can't handle it. Now, we know the world is balanced. So at that point, God truly took away from us idolatry. And that's why we don't find it ever afterwards in the Jewish people as an issue. Meaning throughout the duration of the Second Temple, when the Jews in general were far spiritually weaker than the First Temple, but they're never sinning with idolatry. It's not an issue. Even in the times like the story of Hanukkah, when Jews tried to act like the Greeks, it wasn't really, they weren't really doing idol worship. It was idol worship. It was to be part of the Greek culture, to be Hellenists. It wasn't they cared idol worship. Okay, it's part of what Hellenists do. We wear certain togas. We call each other Jason. We go to gymnasiums. All right, we'll worship their idols too. It was just cultural. It wasn't a religious passion like it was in the First Temple. And that's continued throughout the duration of our exile. So even if Jews under the Muslims accepted the Islamic religion at certain points, and Jews under the Christians accepted Christianity, it never came from a need for idol worship. It was always more like a survival issue, either sometimes, very rarely, a Jew wanting to get ahead in life and escape the constricting bonds of being Jewish, of what that meant. That was very rare. And more common was enormous pressure from the people around them to accept their religion or be killed. So this didn't happen as often by the Muslims. There were sometimes fanatical Islamic tribes that did proselytize, meaning accept our religion or we'll kill you. And very, very often, of course, we had that with the Christians. But when the Jews did it, they weren't doing it from any desire to serve idols, from any belief in these religions. It was a wrong, life-saving gesture. So the need to serve idols was taken away at this point. Now, everything is balanced in this world. So if God removed the desire for idolatry, he can't just take that away. He had to balance it with something else. So some say, one version is that God took away the desire for idolatry, but he balanced it out by a different temptation of atheism. Meaning, until this, with idolatry, you're believing in a God. You might be believing in many gods. You might be believing in the wrong God, but you believe in a deity. If we're taking away idolatry, we're going to replace it with a lack of belief in God at all. What the Alter Rebbe says, that's some, different people speculate or sages say different concepts of where was the balancing act. Some say that removing the temptation of idolatry was also balanced by the removal of the prophets. Meaning, just as there was this enormous desire for idolatry, there was this enormous revelation of God of a prophet who's literally from his mouth comes God's words. So if we're taking away the desire for idolatry, we're going to take away the revelation of the prophecy. Of course, prophecy existed, but in a very hidden way. So the overt prophecy is gone as the overt desire to serve idols is gone as a balancing act. So that's another answer to that question. The Alter Rebbe, the first Rebbe, the first leader of Chabad Hasidus, his answer is that idolatry continued in a different form. The desire to worship a piece of wood, a stone, a piece of gold, the sun, the moon, that God took away, but God instead created a different idol for us that we started worshiping. And that idol is the idol of materialism. So the pursuit of money, the pursuit of objects, of possessions, the need to have an acquisition of things, that became the idol that people lusted after. Meaning maybe in the times of the first temple, they didn't care if they had granite countertops or not. They didn't care of the make and model of their cars, so to speak. They weren't into that. That wasn't what they were worshiping. They were worshiping the stones and the moon and the grass and the sun and the sea. So we don't worship the sun and the moon and the grass and the sea, but we worship physical possessions. According to the Alter Rebbe, that's where the desire for idolatry went. So it's in a more mild fashion, but on some level, he's saying it's still there. Okay, any questions on anything we've said till now? Okay, so we will stop at this point. We are not done, but I know we're after time. So we'll stop at this point. And again, remember we said this Wednesday is Rosh Chodesh. It's a very, very special day because Rosh Chodesh is always a special day. It's a day when our highest spiritual powers are inside of our body. The Chaya Yechida, the upper spiritual powers, are integrated. It's the most Mashiach day of the month. And this month is a very Mashiach month. So the most Mashiach day of a very Mashiach month. It's really powerful Mashiach energy. And from Wednesday through the 9 days of next Thursday, to add, if you can, in prayer, like maybe say an extra chapter of Psalms or an extra piece of prayer, to add if you can in charity, maybe give an extra coin in the morning and afternoon, and to add if you can in Torah study. We said maybe go online and learn some of the laws of the temple, because it's very important during these days to rebuild the temple by learning about it. So you should have a good week, and thank you for joining. See you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.